here we go. Hi, thank you for coming. This is another edition of the webinar in collaboration between the student of the Degrowth Master at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and Debt for Climate. And today we have a very special guest with Bhumika Muchhala, who is a critical feminist political economist and theorist. She serves as a senior advisor with the Third World Network and as a lecturer in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management program at the New School in New York. Did I say that right, Bhumika? Am I right? Okay, cool. And we have, of course, a few students from the master with us today. Thank you all for coming. You're welcome to intervene and ask questions or comment at any point. Raise your hand, and Bhumika, I will keep track of the chat so you can focus on speaking. Let's get started, right? Bhumika, my first question, to try to get back to basics and explain the core concepts. What is climate debt?
Yes, no, this is a great question to start with. And first of all, thank you very much for this invitation, and I truly very deeply apologize for the delay that I have caused all of you. I'm very happy to be here and just thrilled that some of you can also be here despite my delay. So I really wanted to personally apologize for that. Thanks for the starting off with this introduction and the first question. Absolutely relevant first question. Think to situate and to ground ourselves, we look at climate debt as a claim and a discourse within global governance, and it has a foundation on multiple grounds: historical, moral, ethical, but also policy, economic, ecological, and environmental. And they're all different grounds. And where I would come in personally with a climate debt conceptualization is to focus on the distinct dimension of ecological debt, in that it is not just a question of remuneration or financial payments, but a question of active change making that is necessary as an owing back to the global south in relation to the century plus of unequal polluting of the atmosphere, warming of the climate, devastation of environment related to a warming climate under disproportionate burdens. So the disproportionate burdens is related to something I'm sure you're all very familiar with, vis-a-vis the advent of industrialization in the early 1900s onward. The charts, the graphs, very well known and in popular circulation, that shows the carbon emissions related to industrialization being literally a upward regression line, right? So we're really talking about this period of industrialization that is centered in the north, that has disproportionate effects on the global south. So a key caveat in that is when in at the on the onset, when there is a misunderstanding of but this isn't territorial, it's not similar to the territorial history of colonization, where there was a physical presence in the global south. And the answer to that is twofold: that yes, climate debt, while we're operating on the grounds of the historical colonial debt, is not the same as territorial presence. We have to look at the overall aggregate. Well, first of all, we have to look at the fact that it's about climate, so it's not territorial. Anything related to the planet and the atmospheric climate question is it does not know physical borders. But the second issue that we often point out is that in this time period, the global south was the terrain upon which the ecological extraction was done. In the past, we know this through the mining and the plantations and the oil rigging. We know this through all the forms of extraction, which are past to present in continuation. But in the current juncture of the last century plus, we allude to the organization of export oriented development. And the classic example is when you have a developing country where 90% of their carbon emissions is related to their export sectors. So that is the scenario we're looking at in climate debt, where even the carbon emissions that are experienced by the global south has a direct line to the monoculture, plantation, extractive production they are doing related to their global trade needs, related to their export oriented development structures, which come from the colonial model, right? As opposed to in degrowth, we stress the self sufficiency and subsistence, self reliance model of producing for what is needed for the community and for people rather than producing for the world markets as the a priori. So this is just a framing on which we would say climate debt is that developed countries, the rich world, are responsible for over 75% of historical carbon emissions, while they possess less than 20% of the global population. So the historical and current carbon emissions entrench limitations to atmospheric space, lead to a warming world, and constrain the right to development for the global south. So, climate debt is the claim simply that climate reparations are required in response to past and current harm.
I thank you for this comprehensive outlook here. How does climate debt relate to sovereign debt, right? From a strictly financial standpoint, debt is money owed to creditors, whereas climate debt is the cost of pollution that is unfairly impacting countries in the global south. So how do these two debt influence one another? How do they interact? Is there a connection between them?
Yes, thank you. This is at the very heart of what, for example, the Debt for Climate movement and no climate justice without debt justice and all the movements you really that have a lot of the social movements today in the global spaces. And this is absolutely at the heart of my current research and writing and also political education and pedagogy. And I guess the heart of it is that we have a situation of a protracted vicious cycle, a classic vicious cycle, the kind that economists, ecologists, social scientists, political scientists have been talking about for a long time. And this vicious cycle is one in which the climate crisis exacerbates the debt crisis. The debt crisis exacerbates the response to climate resilience. This classic vicious cycle is one in which you have the material and the monetary losses. And material, I'm talking we're life world, human, infrastructure, community, resilience, livelihoods, agriculture, health. So you have these multi-dimensional, and here I correct myself sometimes because the academic language may be material and monetary, but really we're talking about a life world, holistic, multi-dimensional losses of climate catastrophes, as well as the financial losses that trigger and exacerbate sovereign debt crises, while the vulnerability to climate disaster increases the cost of borrowing. So, the debt challenge related to the climate crisis has many dimensions. We need to historicize it through the longue durée of the colonial creation of debt. We need to politicize it in that there is a political issue where responses to sovereign debt are not being created. And there's also the epistemic dimension, where we need to look at the very real history of the construction of neoliberalism, the Chicago School of Economics, and monetarism, where it is kind of global consensus in the Gramscian sense of the consensus making and common sense making that macro finances of sovereigns need to have low inflation, low deficits, and so-called sustainable debt. The idea of sustainable debt not really being rooted in historical realities, where the rich countries had momentary periods of high debt and high deficits and high inflation in order to pursue a big push of industrialization, of economic diversification, of job creation, of investments. But the historical reality is very often occluded, it is hidden, it is obscured, and there is this overwhelming normative focus that is quite ahistorical, in that countries have to abide by a certain kind of epistemic straitjacket. So we look at the debt crisis today. The debt crisis today is not new. The Global South has been in debt crisis for many decades, but in particularly contracted debt crisis since the 1980s oil debt crisis that had origins that were quite similar to today, that are triggered by the oil shock, triggered by inflation, triggered by interest rate hikes. So the debt distress, the debt burdens we have today are at a historical high. It is a 50-year high, a 50-year high. But also we have to look at that just since the global financial crisis, which political economists and pundits and all the progressive heterodox thinkers were saying was sort of the full reveal of the contradictions of capitalism and the full expression of the late stage capitalism. But in fact, since the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, debt burdens across the global south have multiplied by over 125%. So there's been an exponential multiplication of debt burdens. So today we have a situation where across the global south, on average, developing countries are allocating an average of 38% of their budget to debt payments. So this is both domestic and foreign debt payments. It's absorbing 38% of public budgets and 30% of public spending. In the African continent, these figures rise to 54% of the public budget on average and 40% of public spending on average. This is such an exorbitant amount that it constitutes twice the amount of spending in education across the global south, 9.5 times that of health spending across the global south, 13.5 times that of social protection spending. And for the limited number of countries that report their annual climate public expenditure, or the annual public expenditure allocated to climate adaptation and mitigation and climate resilience overall within the ambit of the nationally determined contributions measurements for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. For those countries, it has been calculated by researchers that debt servicing amounts to 32 times that of climate spending. And we know this generally, that the amount being spent on debt servicing is much higher than the amount being spent on climate investment, climate resilience. So every dollar spent, every euro, every dollar, every unit of currency spent on debt repayments is resources not spent on climate resilience, on health, on education, on social protection. It's every dollar on debt is a dollar withdrawn from the potential of climate recovery and climate resilience. So it is in this political economy context where climate debt becomes entangled and absolutely imbricated with sovereign debt through this mechanism of sovereign debt payments to institutional and bondholder creditors. And as a consequence of this debt distress, especially in order to restructure this debt, developing countries have to go to the International Monetary Fund as an a priori condition, as a precondition to being able to even enter into debt restructuring negotiations with creditor committees. And these IMF financial assistance loans carries austerity conditions. So there you have the ultimate vicious cycle of the high debt being such a structural challenge to climate resilience, leading also to austerity measures that further compound the credit crunch, the public purse. It further reduces and contracts the public budget for the very things that debt is absorbing: health, education, social protection, climate. So not only do you have a vicious cycle, but the political economy of debt that is tied to austerity, fiscal austerity, also called the debt austerity trap. The more debt, the more austerity. The more austerity, the more debt. The more debt, the more climate injustice. And this vicious cycle is a lock-in. It is a lock-in vis-a-vis compounding intersectional inequalities, right? So the poorest, the women, those who are on the margins of society, those who are systematically discriminated against. So you have not just the deprivations, but you have the intensification of intergenerational and intersectional inequalities, which leads to the situation we have today, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and those on the intersections see a cyclical continuity of immiseration. So the climate and debt cycle is one of deeply human and ecological injustice intertwined. It keeps the unequal class relations that underpin our understanding of historical materialism vis-a-vis a pluralist Marxist lens. It's a kind of superstructure that locks these inequalities into place.
Okay, okay. That is quite profound, actually, right? This idea of debt and climate cycle. I would like to ask you about sovereign debt a little bit more, because I think it's something that is unclear for many in terms of the historical reasons, the historical background of this sovereign debt. So, how did developing countries from the global south, highly indebted countries, became indebted to developed countries in the first place? What happened historically there, if we look further back?
Absolutely. Looking further back is critical. It's indispensable. We need to look further back. I want to just remind all of us, as I always remind myself as well, routinely, that the world of policy is quite intentionally ahistorical. We talk about these policy issues as if, you know, as if it's some sort of a contemporary problem that it emerged as recently as shopping malls. We also, in policy discourses, we tend to depoliticize. And we generally also in the policy spaces, we don't theorize. So I often say my slogan or my mantra to myself oftentimes is we have to historicize, we have to politicize, we have to theorize, right? We have a duty to do this in order to understand the full picture and in order to understand in truth, to understand in holistic truth telling, and not to be part of the, you know, the very systematic manufacturing of simple formulations of half truths and of the potential to spiral into many distractions of mitigation that don't look at the root causes. So if we look at the root causes, I think my favorite quote I oftentimes repeat is from Thomas Sankara, who is speaking in 1987 to a gathering of African Union heads of state and ministers in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And Thomas Sankara says, debt's origins are colonialism's origins. Debt comes from colonialism. Those who lend us money are those who colonized us. Those who lend us money are the same people who used to manage our states and economies. They are the very colonizers who indebted Africa. And in this quote is actually quite a lot in terms of making the linkages, but historicizing sovereign debt in colonial history, we have to look at a couple of different factors, right? We look at the one factor of the pure drain of wealth. That's the material. And drain of wealth is actually a theoretical formulation that was advanced in the as early as 1901, where one of the foremost leading intellectuals in India, who was an anti-colonial scholar, anti-colonial politician, he actually wrote a book, and in the book, which was a treatise, really documenting systematically how the industries and the resources of India were drained. And this is not necessarily to focus narrowly on India, but to paint a portrait of what colonial mechanisms and practices did. And his book was titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. And his drain of wealth theory is that poverty in India is not caused by internal factors, but by the systematic draining of wealth by colonial British rule. And following right in his footsteps, there was another author the year after, R.C. Dutt, who argued in another second book, The Economic History of India, which was a systematic portrait of the different sectors and the different agricultural, that the drain of wealth constituted the mass proportion of a colony's wealth. So really looking at the enrichment of the East India Company and the impoverishment of India, and really paralleled those those material amounts. But he also then really pointed out the taxation, the revenues, and the distinction between the outright colonial plunder. When most people think about colonization, they think of some kind of a simple plunder, a simple theft, that you took the resources and left, as if you took these resources and they're now in the British Museum, and the artifacts and the treasure chests of gold coins and jewels, and there's this very easy Hollywood portrait of this plunder of resources, but in fact the actual plunder was done through a very complex and systematic extraction of financial resources, through taxation of land, taxation of peasants, through the free extraction of commodities, whether it's cotton or indigo or gold or diamonds or rubber or timber or cinnamon or nutmeg. It's the free extraction, right? You're not paying money to you're not, there's in the colonial extraction model, you don't have a process of actually like buying these goods for use in your country. You're extracting these goods and then you are re-exporting it for handsome sums. So it is this fantastic way of making money out of making enormous wealth out of what was a very unfree trade, a very coercive trade of pure extraction. But when we talk about the colonial history, we're talking about something deeper, right? We're talking about the hollowing out of productive capacities, of the making of the plantationocene. Plantationocene as a term for the systematic kind of retardation or disarticulation or stunting or distortion. And in fact, it is a kind of distortion of the local economy where rather than its full organic expression in various different sectors, in industries that are homegrown, such as the textile and weaving industries that come from long lineages, millennia of trade on a global scale, that are connected to indigenous and local knowledge systems and praxis, connected to local ways of society, of local ways of expressing cultures. So this breaking of the traditional economic structures and economic sectors, and the distortion into the extractive plantations, be it the cotton plantation, the coffee plantation, the rubber plantation, the timber plantation. So this disarticulated the expression of the local economies and entrenched an extractive plantationocene through terms of trade have been rendered artificially cheap extractive natural resource based commodities or raw material commodities. Through the International Division of Labor have been rendered into cheapened labor. Through the International Division of Finance have been cheapened into low currency value. So these are what works together. It is colonial history that cemented the International Division of Labor, the International Unequal Currency Hierarchy, the International Division of Finance. I separate the International Division of Finance from the International Currency Hierarchy because the International Division of Finance, it is related to the fact that because you're poor, you must have a high interest rate in order to compensate for the greater risk of being poor. Right? This is what happens also with consumer debt. The poorer you are, the higher the risk, the higher the interest rate that the bank gives you. So that's the International Division of Finance. International Currency Hierarchy is that the poorer you are, the less your currency is worth. International Division of Labor. Colonial history created also a huge amount of unemployment across the former colonies. So the International Division of Labor means that all of this unemployment makes their labor so cheap, right? All of these things work together with the shape, the structure of the economy being disarticulated. And when you put this together in a picture, in a holistic sense, you see how colonialism created debt. Because the conditions of debt are rooted in this disarticulation of economy, of labor, of currency, of value. And there also we have necessarily that a colonial historical and political approach to understanding debt means that we have to leave the very narrow conception of debt in the monetary sense. We have to look at debt through the disavowal of structural transformation. We have to look at debt through the lens of structural transformation. So this leads to, I think, one of the core stipulations that debt justice requires a lot more than debt cancellation, a lot more than a statutory mechanism for sovereign debt restructuring or the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism or the UN Convention on Debt. Debt justice is necessarily connected to this picture of the denial of structural transformation for the global south. So, a true path to debt justice is that of economic sovereignty and economic justice and holistic multidimensional liberation for the global south that is related to the reparations of these multidimensional disarticulations. So, structural transformation and holistic reparations in order to address the vicious cycle of debt, or in order to address debt colonialism today. So, I think I went into some of the other questions. I kind of tied together some of
Yes,
the.
definitely, definitely. That's all good. It's all good because I wasn't planning on having the time to ask everything. So you're welcome to answer all of them at once. It's all good. Actually, the one I wanted to move on to the epistemic part of your research, and this interview is basically based on a paper that you wrote for the handbook on post growth. Is it the handbook on development? Do you remember the reference? I don't have it in mind.
It's
Sorry.
the Sage Handbook on eco-social policy and
Thank
politics.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for I didn't note that
And
down.
it just came out in March this year, just recently.
I wanted to ask you about the epistemic part, which is really the science part, if you will. Like I'm just trying to explain this word because we've been talking about this word between students. It's kind of hard to understand. It's what we know, right? How do we know things? And things that we can know are, for example, economics, and economic theory. How did economic theory explain the historical process while it was happening? How did we come to this, right? So, because this is so damning, right? What you're describing is such a cruel and unfair situation. How does economic theory explain that, and how can we try to undo this status quo in economic scientific thinking, if I can use that word?
Hmm. Sure. Yes. I mean, it the I mean, it's been well debated that economics is not a science. That the the technocracy is politics and technical drag. I always go back to that quote that economics is merely politics and technical drag, because oftentimes you can use economic arguments and econometric modeling for whichever argument you want to advance. You know, so I think what actually governs the process more is your political standpoint or whatever your argumentation is. Um, they often say you can you can mold the economics to whatever argument you want to advance, right? So I think what I do in understanding epistemic imperialism, and understanding the epistemic imperialism of economics is I use decolonial theory's conceptualization of economic coloniality. Economic coloniality is that we have a a real singularity and a hegemony of economic epistemology that shapes economic and financial institutions, actors, and policies. And you have a very narrow conceptualization of neoclassical economics and its subsequent, bastard childs of neoliberalism that really determine this singularity of thinking, doing, and being in economic policy making and economic praxis. So by the imperialism, we also are talking about how the plurality of economic thought is oftentimes erased. There is a systematic disavowal and systematic exclusion. It's a very intentional exclusion of the plurality of economic thought. By plurality of economic thought, we refer to feminist economic thought, ecological, dependency, world systems, Keynesian, developmentalist, structuralist, and in fact, many other types of economic thought that are marginalized, obscured, they're devalued, they are presented as less rigorous, as only applying to women or environment, so they cannot be the main view. And all of these ways of marginalization then lead to a lack of their legitimacy. So students in economics department don't want to study dependency and world systems or feminist and ecological or developmentalist and structuralist because it's, not going to be considered a legitimate or valid economic degree, right? So there is this singularity that is advanced. When we're talking about debt in particular and the current iteration of economics, we oftentimes do go back to this two kind of, in terms of unpacking the economic imperialism today, we go back to two main pillars of hegemonic economic making, or the hegemonic formulation of ideas, interests, and agendas in the economic worldview. So the most well known is, of course, the Chicago School, the Chicago School of Economics, which is the locus of neoclassical economic price theory or monetarism, and price theory, which came to define all economics departments very much through key figures such as Milton Friedman, very well known, but also Gary Becker and many others at that time, who very consistently argued that price theory is the true economic science, that it is the true empirical verification of economic science. And it was extremely emphatic and singular and deterministic. So it was around this time period, not that long ago. It was a post-war time period between 1948 and 1976, oftentimes thought of as the post-war years of socialism, the post-war golden years, where the decades before the advent of the Reagan Thatcher, there is no alternative brand of neoliberalism. So we often glorify these years, but it was actually during these years that there was an active formulation and entrenchment of the Chicago School of Monetary Economics. And it is this monetarism, monetary economics, that underpins most, that really underpins most thinking today. In brief, its principle is that of freedom. Is really their defining principle is freedom. But how do they define freedom in their defining principle? Free markets, free choices of individuals, free a range of options, free so-called competition. And this free became so big and so powerful that another critical word, that of equality, equality of distribution, equality of outcome, equality of production, of consumption, was completely swallowed over by free. So, in essence, it was a battle between free and equal, and free won. There shouldn't actually be a battle. It shouldn't be a trade-off. It shouldn't be an either/or. There should be ways of working, of integrating, and freedom for what? Freedom from whom? Right, into principle of equality, because it's exactly inequality that erodes freedom, actually. But so they were extremely successful, especially through their key manifesto book, which Friedman published in 1962, titled Capitalism and Freedom. And in that book, in the very beginning on page 8, it claims that economic freedom is an end in itself. But Friedman never defines freedom, even in the book. He doesn't define freedom or consider the various dimensions of human society, politics, and culture. There was another key event which predates the Chicago School of Economics, and this is the interwar era, which many authors such as Quinn Slobodian and Horn and Philip Mirowski, they talk about this Mont Pelerin Society. And the Mont Pelerin Society that is really around the time period between World War I and World War II was an elite, white, male, absolutely imperial society. And this time period, the colonies were still, this is the real, like, fomenting of anti-colonial movements. But these men come from places where colonialism is still raging, right? I mean, you still have colonies in 1920s and in the 1930s. So we're talking about the decades of the 1920s and 1930s. Very much 1930s especially, where you have very opaque, closed-door, secretive meetings that are held in this beautiful mountain town, I think like a ski resort location in Switzerland called Vevey. And the Mont Pelerin Society would get together in Switzerland multiple times, and they formed a kind of society, as many of the societies of power tend to be secretive little clubs. This secretive club also turned out to be the central locus of the development of the neoliberal doctrine in the post-war world. And we have to understand that the Chicago School of Economics, they built on this neoliberal doctrine, right? They took the neoliberal doctrine of the MPS and they scientified it. they technocratized it. They put the modeling and the price theory. They put in these very they undergirded it with essentially what we understand today as monetarism or monetary theory, price theory. So these ideas and narratives in the Mont Pelerin Society created the true epistemic community. And the initial formulations of epistemic community is not like what we do in the pedagogy of the classroom or in social movements or in progressive alliances and coalitions. Epistemic community oftentimes refers to a small group of elites who discuss ideas that are very exclusive and contained within that group of elites. So, you have certain key figures, the British economist Frederick Benham, the German economist Wilhelm Röpke, and they really developed these neoliberal doctrines through the lens of colonialism and rooted in Victorian anthropologies that characterize colonies as societies without the discipline to save money. Colonies do not have entrepreneurs or the animal spirit of competition or the spiritual moral preconditions that could eventually generate entrepreneurs, quote unquote. So these extremely racist, extremely white supremacist ideas and belief systems. It generated the soup, it generated the belief systems, right? Because these are not just things that they are making up, like they're really advancing these as arguments, as legitimate ideas, right? As legitimate sort of argumentations, pointing to examples in the colonies as well. So this is the belief system that underpins how industrialization in the colonies is rendered a taboo, and ideas of white man's burden, that we have to economically guide the colonies, or we have to be the economic masters of the colonies, started to take shape. Um, and it was also then an extremely powerful way to to vilify or demonize, like, corrupt alliances between so-called Western socialists and the anti-colonial movements. Because let's remember, there was also currents of socialism within the same spaces. These spaces are not static. So the Mont Pelerin Society is also, it's not just it's not just the colonies that they are demonizing. They also have a very clear intention of demonizing the Western socialists, the socialists in their own society, right? So you have these ideas and belief systems and very racist, supremacist narratives of the Mont Pelerin Society that then infuse and interlock with the monetarism of the Chicago School. And this is essentially what creates the economic imperialism of the current moment, right? The claims that the market will, naturally conjure the conditions for flourishing, and that the free market comes first, and that the normative market of services and goods has to be free of restrictions and regulations and borders. And one of the most important things I feel is that you know this was the time period, these ideas also really cemented the way in which the state was to be treated, right? That the state, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say also is that during the Mont Pelerin Society, we have to locate also that the Mont Pelerin Society was meeting before the colonies were given the ability to be sovereign states. And one key understanding that for me has been relatively new, and I'm disheartened that I did not understand this before in my trajectory, and I'm very glad that I understand it now, and I wish to maybe spend more dedicated time to research this particular aspect, which is quite fascinating, is that of the construction of sovereignty. The construction of sovereignty for the colonies rested on this key idea, key doctrine from the Mont Pelerin Society, that the state would become a vehicle, a vessel to protect and encase and facilitate the market. That the state would be the servant of private capital accumulation, that it would facilitate private capital accumulation. And this helped me understand, well, that is what led to the decolonization movement. Not from the South, but from the perspective of the colonizer. Because I've spent most of my life trajectory in my career very much understanding the lens of the South. But recently, to understand the lens of the colonizer, to understand the logics, the mechanisms, the rationalities, and the strategic deployment and arrangement of conditions and preconditions and belief systems and assemblages the arrangement of institutions and ideas has been really helpful to understand neoliberalism today, right? Where did it come from? How is it that the vast majority of governments and states service the market and investors and private capital and capital flows and investor confidence and foreign investment over and above their own people, over and above their own environment? I grew up in Indonesia, and my parents are from India. And growing up in Indonesia, and I've spent most of my life now in the United States and also in London and in Geneva, actually. So being from multiple cultures and spaces and across borders, for me, it's been important to understand that everywhere I go, every society I've lived in, every multilateral process I've been involved in, UN multilateral processes on financing for development, and even I was very much involved in sort of the initial Sustainable Development Goals negotiations before they were completely corporate washed. The initial formulations that were coming from the Global South, actually, of sustainable development being that of economic sovereignty. That was the initial formulation, and then of course it got it got greenwashed and blue washed and pink washed, rainbow washed. But in understanding why and how the state prioritizes capital before their people and environment, these ideas that were advanced in the Mont Pelerin Society, that the state was to be strategically deployed to protect the market, has been extremely helpful to understand then the macro framework of free capital flows, of foreign direct investments, of deregulation of public interest and environmental laws, of financial deregulation, of financialization. These are then more current iterations. It is a very different conversation, but how do we get to the point we are in today, where every service, every human, every commodity, every phenomenon can be financialized? You can financialize anything into an asset. You can turn absolutely anything into an abstract financial unit, right? Whether it is being used or whether it is not being used. Offsets are an example of how you can financialize land that is not being used. And otherwise, you can financialize just about anything else that is being used, from your Apple iPhone to your diamond rings. And of course, all your commodities in the supermarket are financialized through food futures. So to understand financialization, which is a much later iteration of the Mont Pelerin Society, I think it is important to go back to these eras, to go back to these ideas, to go back to the way in which the normative market that can defy restrictions, that can protect itself from the discontent and resistance of communities, that can protect itself from social outrage and dissent and revolution, how this was formulated. And in fact, I must say, the more I learn about this, the more I am thoroughly impressed with how these vicious ideas were formulated through such a complex, multi-dimensional view, right? It wasn't just that they were talking about the racial superiority. It wasn't just that they were talking about the financial accumulation. It wasn't just that they were talking about being protected from revolution and dissent, and but they were really strategizing how to turn the anti-colonial movement, which they knew as they were meeting in Switzerland, they knew the anti-colonial movement is going ahead. There's nothing they can ultimately do about the claim for sovereignty and independence. And the devising and the strategizing was, well, how do we strategically manipulate the anti-colonial movement so that the eventual sovereignty that is coming will be political, not economic, will be normative, not functional? How do we maintain the satellite status of dependency and power and control through so-called sovereignty? And these are, I think, the formulations that are not in the textbooks. They would not be in the written writings, but this is, I think, the part of the fields of anthropology and sociology that have fleshed out in a lot of literature how when we as social movements and as academics and as progressive thinkers, when we think and extrapolate on how the decolonization movement was political, not economic, how neocolonialism is still flourishing well, and not just from a north-south dimension, but we have to understand neocolonialism from a south dimension as well, right? We have to understand it also as the fact that the role of China is not one of liberation and sovereignty either. It is still grounded in these very ideas of private capital accumulation, not the same as Europe and the United States and the settler colonies, but similar in terms of having the market as imperative. It's certainly not democratic socialist. So we have to understand it from a South dimension as well. And on that, I have the duty to also mention that colonialism has manifold expressions. So we need to consider as well internal colonialism. And internal colonialism is when in the global South, the state does to its own land, to its own people, what colonization used to. So it's a sort of cannibalization of your own state. And one very one simple explanation is that a global South sovereign cannot encroach other territories, so it encroaches its own. It eats itself, in that sense of kind of the cannibalization effect of capital, right? So I'm sorry this went on to a different trajectory, really, but I think it's important to understand that these are the economic ideas, and this is the economic imperialism that really undergirds how private capital accumulation, how the investor class, how the oligarchy, the 1%, the tech billionaires, everything we are seeing today of how capital comes before human life was cemented, right? It's not natural, it's not normal, it's not inevitable. It wasn't always this. It was many different things in different parts of, right? As a human species, we've been around tens of thousands of years, and there have been other iterations of our organization. And if we look at the sort of the high priest of capital, we're talking about relative period of 5 to 6 centuries. That's a drop in the bucket of how long we've been around. So that quote is often put forward of, God, I just was reading this author the other day, but I'm forgetting the name of the author. But it's easier to imagine the end of human civilization than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? But we need to, we all know that quote. I forget the author. Maybe if one of you has the author on hand.
I don't have it, Bhumika. I need to be conscious of
think
time. I really hate
I
to
think
interrupt.
some people account it to like Frederick Jameson, but I think it's also
Yes,
like debatable who
yes,
actually said it. Yeah.
yes. So yeah, just want to conclude by some hope that I think this quote is wrong. If we look at the longue durée, this quote oftentimes gets cemented when we just look at a short amount of time, but we look at a longer period of time, um, we can counter Mr. James's quote or Professor James's quote, right? So
Go ahead,
yes.
Annie. I was going to invite you to.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk, and it was really interesting to listen to you make all these connections and piece things together. I was just interested if you have any like recommendations for like reading up on like the last part that you were talking about, like especially like these ties between like Montpellier society and like the decolonial or like like co-optation basically of anti-colonial movements. You were mentioning Quinn Slobodian, but I don't know if he has this like specific focus on like anti-colonial movements. So if you have any recommendation on that, and also the part on the Sustainable Development Goals initial formulation. I've never heard of that before. And I'm very happy to hear that such a thing had existed, even though it makes me sad that, well, they didn't pass through. But yeah, if you have any like recommendations on where people can find out more about that, it would be amazing.
So Annie, very very quick answers. Um, on the Sustainable Development Goals, I have written an article published in the World Development Journal in 2020, so several years ago now. And I can send that article to you right away. So that I have written about, I've researched about. We did archival research going back to the 1970s, the FUNEX Report Commission. Um, on the first question, I very much hope that we can collaborate. That is exactly what I'm looking for. So if you find things, send them to me. If I find things, I'll send them to you. I'm very much looking for this. I'm very much looking for more detailed archival. And in fact, if some of these things don't exist, I think it's imperative that some of us figure out ways to create it. There is a lot on Mont Pelerin society. There is a lot on the decolonization era, but I haven't found a lot that makes the link. The decolonization era is oftentimes from the struggles of the anti-colonial movements, and it's from the lens of the global south. And there's a lot of historical texts. There's a lot of political science texts. Then the stuff from all the sort of, like, for example, I think the book The Globalists, and also Philip Murawski's book. There's several other texts on Mont Pelerin society. Talks about the formulation of the ideas, but the link to the response to the anti-colonial insurgency. I haven't found that link. I haven't found that link, that specific link of how the ideas of the state facilitating the market would become the grounds upon which sovereignty would be permitted by the colonizers. And that specific link I haven't found. And in fact, I very much support and urge you to look into this and to share with all of us.
I was taking note of that. If anybody is looking for an idea for a thesis, we use the word TFM for our thesis. It's actually a Spanish acronym, but it's basically our master's thesis. So I'm sure some people will be looking for that.
Yeah, maybe
I think we
someone is
should.
looking for a cool
Yeah,
topic and a very cool supervisor here.
exactly.
Sorry for throwing you under the bus.
No, that's great. I think that would be amazing. Laura, we can't hear you. Are you talking? No, you're not. Sorry, Laura.
No, it's mostly that I mean, thank you for this space. I love this conversation. It's pretty much one that I was looking forward to have. I love all the linkages, and precisely now one of the lines that I've been exploring is precisely how the interventions in the creation of central banks in South America, in the case of Colombia, Peru, and Mexico in the early 1930s. It was kind of like the initial point to create the system and the monetary system, and how these countries specifically with that infrastructure and financial infrastructure have evolved in a very particular way. So I don't know if have you have explored those areas too, and how the creation of these infrastructures with, of course, members of the Mont Pelerin society from Brazil, from Peru, from Mexico, from Colombia, in these specific countries, um, it just chose to me kind of like some of the seeds to further interventions in the monetary systems. But I mean, this is pretty located in South America. So I don't know if you have ideas around that and other cases uh, related to that.
Laura. Yes, yeah, no, thank you for this. I know Antoine has my email, so I would be very happy if you wanted to email me a short description or a concept note of your project or your proposal, and I could try to send some text resources. I think South America in particular, I would just say, I think even what I alluded to today was maybe a little bit, forgive me, but quite maybe generic and overall. It wasn't specifically contextualized to South America. And then just to point out that, like, the story of the indigenous genocide is very different from the story of transatlantic slavery, is very different from the story of the kind of trade and tax and extraction based in Asia. So there's a very different story in all these regions. And of course, then it gets even more minutiae and more contextualized. But I think for South America in particular, it is astonishing to me in the literature and in the overall discourses, from academia to social movements to even progressive political spaces, how the past to present questions of indigeneity are not centered in the historical making of South America, right? Do we understand many South American nations as settler colonies? How do we understand the history in the Amazon? We don't have as much exposure to these histories as we even do to, for very real reasons of the primacy and urgency that we do to other stories of the transatlantic slavery and the more corporate histories of the East India and the Dutch East Indies companies. So vis-a-vis South America, I would say I am still learning about the full dimension of indigeneity. I'm still very much a student of indigeneity. I think there's a lot to learn from indigeneity, in terms of the resistance movements, but also in terms of how it is, I think, at least in my view, the most extreme manifestation of of colonial and imperial logic. The most extreme, and I think it needs to be looked at in a more serious and relevant way, because it is today also the leading logic of imperialism today. In a way that in a way that is very unique, right? Because the Palestine genocide and the imperial wars today, it is bringing back old histories in a very relevant way. So I think there's a lot to learn yeah, in this space, yeah. And please, if feel free to email me. And I know that I missed many other students, so if you can share the recording or also just pass along my
I
email,
will.
I'd be happy
I will. I will
to.
definitely. So a lot of students will have missed your intervention and wanted to meet you in person. So, but that will be repaired. No worries. On that note, I think I would like to close the formal recording just to make the format approachable, to keep the format approachable a little bit. Of course, I want to invite everyone to ask another question if they want to, so we don't leave on a sad note. Anyone? Another question for Bhumika? No regrets? All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for watching on YouTube. See you next time. Bhumika, wish you luck on your research. Thank you so much for intervening
Yes.
here.
Thank you all. Stay in touch. Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.